sheepies! Making mozzarella from scratch sounds intimidating, but I'll show you how it's actually surprisingly simple and absolutely worth it. Hello shepherds, welcome back. And if you're new here, hello! This is where we talk all things sheepy. My name is Megan, and today we're making quick mozzarella. So in just over 30 minutes, you can go from sheep milk to the most amazing homemade cheese for today's pizza. And here's exactly how to do it. So let's talk ingredients. Our main star, but also one that gives many people the most trouble, is our milk. So I'm going to get started on processing the cream for butter while we chat. I know not everyone has a dairy animal in their backyard, and that's okay. You can still make delicious homemade mozzarella, but it does take a bit more work to source the best milk. If you're using store-bought milk, it may take a few tries to find a pasteurized milk that will work for cheese making. And definitely stay away from ultra-pasteurized milk. So what happens is that those qualities in ultra-pasteurized milk, and even some pasteurized milks, it denatures the milk proteins at those high temps. And this makes our curd formation ultra soft, or even not at all. So with mozzarella making and other cheese making processes, curd formation is super important. Not only in how our cheeses handle pressing, shaping, forming, and aging, but also our overall cheese yields. So we can work with softer curds, but having a nice, hard, or firm curd is crucial to our finished product. More so with aging hard cheeses, but it's important nonetheless. I think this is really the biggest hurdle to most home cheese making, to find a brand or farmer that works for you. Using super fresh milk helps, which we'll get more into later on, but sometimes it's rough when the milk isn't even working with you. So try not to be hard on yourself if it doesn't go well. We'll also need some rennet. I'm using single strength liquid rennet. Powdered rennet works really well too, but single strength liquid rennet tends to be a bit more user friendly. We'll also need some powdered citric acid. These are available at most home brewing supply stores, as well as baking or candy making shops. Or you can also purchase it online if you can't source it locally. If you have trouble finding a source, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can find for you. For my recipe, I'm using just half a gallon of milk. I've included weights so you can adjust your ingredients to your needs as well. Plus, when working in such small amounts, it's really easier to work in weights. For some of you, it may seem like too little of milk to work with, but the yield is actually really good. And it's a perfect amount for pizza, plus extra for leftovers. For our equipment, we need a thermometer, some large spoons, maybe thermal kitchen gloves, but I've never really liked them, so they're optional for you. Beyond that, you'll need a large stock pot, a strainer, some sort of long skinny knife, a slotted spoon if you have one, but it's not necessary, and a bowl of ice water. So to start, let's prepare our citric acid by mixing our citric acid powder with half a cup of cool water. Stir until it's dissolved and set aside. Next up, let's mix our 1/4 of a cup of cool water and our rennet, and then set aside. When working with cheese in these tiny of amounts, it's literally drop by drop. So this is where having a scale really helps. Let's pour our milk into a stock pot and add our citric acid mixture. Stir well to combine and turn our heat over medium-low heat. Stir gently every few minutes until the milk reaches about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. I like to stop right before our target temperature to allow the thermal energy to take it up to our temperature. You may notice your milk beginning to curdle slightly due to the acidity and temperature. That's okay. Once we reach our temp, let's go ahead and remove our milk from the heat and add in our rennet mixture. Then we want to stir gently for 30 seconds, top to bottom, swirling around. We want our rennet to get to know all the parts of our pot. If we don't properly stir in our rennet, it may cause only parts of our milk to form curds, or pockets of curds in our milk. It can be really hard to save a cheese if this happens. So once it's well combined, let's cover our milk and leave undisturbed for about 5 minutes. It's been about over 5 minutes now. So let's check the curd. It should look like a custard or panna cotta or almost jello-like. Can you see the bounce with a spoon? I can rest my spoon on the curds. And it's quite funny because it can look deceiving. When I pull my curds away from the edge of the pot, you may be able to see it clearer, This is a firm curd, and if yours is softer, that's okay. Give it a few more minutes, say 5 minutes. But if after 30 minutes total and you still don't see an improvement, let's just call it and carry on. You may just have a much lower cheese yield. I'll just have some troubleshooting near the end of the video for more information. Cutting and cooking the curd. Next, let's cut the curds. A common test is a simple slit and then lift to see how the curds are holding up. We're going to cut the curds in about 1-inch-ish bits. I'm not too worried about getting this exact. The main thing for me is airing on the larger rather than smaller cubes. They're about the size of a walnut. This is to prevent too much loss of milk solids into the whey. The whey is a beautiful, pale, clear yellow. If it's milky colored, that's a sign of lower cheese yield. It's okay, but eventually it's fun to learn how to read your whey curds and more to see what's going on with our cheeses. If you're wondering what happens if I cut the curds in smaller bits, it just helps the cheese lose more whey, making for drier cheese. So we're making the slices all the way through from top to bottom of the pot, cutting our curds in a crosshatch pattern. If you see curds a little jagged on the edges, that's okay. It'll still stretch, but maybe be a little rubbery. Next, let's place our pot back onto the stove and heat to 105 degrees Fahrenheit or 41 degrees Celsius, while very slowly stirring the curds with our ladle. I'm trying to be careful to gently handle our curds because I really want my cheese to be super soft. We're going to be stretching our curds in the pot, but if you want to use a microwave, you can. And then let's take our pot off our hot burner and continue to stir slowly for about 2 to 5 minutes. The more time you stir your cheese, the firmer your cheese will be. Transferring and draining the curd. With a slotted spoon or whatever you have on hand, let's go ahead and scoop our curds into a colander or a microwave-safe bowl if you're microwaving your curds. I'll have notes in the description for you on that technique. And while we're doing this, let's turn up the heat on our reserve pot of whey. I'm going to add some more water back into it and heat our pot to about 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 degrees Celsius. Now back to our curds. Once we're done moving all our curds, let's press the curd gently with our hand, pouring off as much whey as possible. Even in this state, I hope you can see it, but it already has that mozzarella-like consistency. I'm fooling with it a lot, but I'm hoping that this will help you see more clearly how your curds will look at each stage. So if you want, you can reserve your whey to use later in baking or as a soup stock. Let me know if you'd like some recipes for using whey. If you're finishing some piggies or have some layers, this is a great way to not only give them a nutrient boost, but also if you sell eggs or whatnot, it's just another way sheep can help passively with income or saving some dollars. Heating curd and removing the whey. Once we're done messing with our curds, if you decide to go for a larger amount, or if you're concerned about heat, it does help to cut the curds up in smaller batches. This means it doesn't take as much time for the curds to get all that heat all the way into the center. It may be easier on your hands, heat-wise as well. Some people use thermal gloves for this step, but I never really found it helpful and I really prefer spoons instead, or my fingers. The curd does cool down really quickly and over time you get what I call mom hands. If you ever worked over a skillet and need to flip breads, sometimes it's just easier to do things by hand. So anyway, I really like this ricotta basket for heating up my curd. If you have a basket strainer, it may help too. The main thing to watch out for when you're heating curds to those really high temps is that it will melt the cheese through these holes and it's a pain to clean. The kids love how it looks and it does give them good laughs. So it's fun, but something to watch out for if you want. Knead and stretch the curd. Now for the extra fun part. I'm using this ricotta basket so that it's easier to pull our curds out of the heat and check it routinely. I want the curds to be pretty warm throughout for the best stretch and the softest cheese. So how do you tell when to stretch? When you find that you need to pull onto your curds to get them to stretch, that's a sign that your curds are still a little bit too cold to work. You may notice that the whey is separating out from our curds as well as we stretch and work our curds. It gets really messy, so I like to stretch it over a pot. Ideally, the curds are so warm that gravity is doing all the stretching for us. It's hot, like really hot, but as we stretch, we're super cooling our cheese down. This is very similar to making some candies, if you ever have the experience with that. So working quickly for the best stretch, I like to aim for just above 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 73 degrees Celsius. Below that temp, it doesn't give you that dramatic stretch. Over time, your hands do get used to working with a hot whey, and it does help to bounce it around between your hands and not letting it rest too much on one spot. Also, using large spoons or a heat-proof strainer or a cheese basket really helps when you need to heat that mess up, pull it out of the hot way, and not really affect your hands. So I'm definitely overworking the cheese here. And ultimately at home, when you're working the cheese, it really only needs about 2 or 3 stretches and it's done. But I'm really hoping with all this overworking, you can really get a good eye on what you may see at home. I love eating the soft cheeses as is, just a snack, but if you find yours too rubbery, it's still a good cheese. It's okay. So if the cheese gets too stiff mid-pull, let's return it back to the hot way and let it warm thoroughly through and through, and then stretch. Once you're done forming your cheese, it's time to set our cheese. Setting our cheese. So there's still so much residual warmth in the cheese, it'll slowly slump as it cools. To fix that, we want to chill our cheese down as fast as possible. So let's pull out our ice water bath and cool it down for a few minutes. Once cooled, we can store it in the fridge where it'll last for several days, although it's always best when eaten fresh. For an extra touch of flavor and help maintain its shape, I like to place in a light brine solution of a salted whey for about 10 to 15 minutes. If we store it in the iced water bath or resting in a dish without being raised up a bit, it can get slimy as the cheese continues to lose a tad of the whey and react with the liquids. Brining our cheese or elevating our cheese helps keep our cheese from getting slimy. So once cooled, it can be stored in the fridge where it will last for several days, although it's always best when eaten fresh. Unlike traditional cheese, which uses a precise technique to age well, this cheese shortcuts that with citric acid, so it's best eaten fresh or frozen for later use. Because of the nature of sheep's milk's specific qualities, it stores really well frozen and keeps a lot of the integrity over time. So now that we have our cheese ready, I'm going to put it away and come back to it when I'm ready to make some pizza. So some time has passed and now we can cook. For today's pizza, we're going to be adding some homegrown herbs, freshly picked tomatoes, and a mix of soft sheep cheese with our fresh sheep milk mozzarella. This is a softer sheep cheese that I made earlier yesterday. I have a video that I'll link if you want to experiment making some soft cheeses too. And some good substitutions are chev or ricotta. Now let's put this all together. For today's pizza recipe, I was inspired by King Arthur's thin crust recipe. I love how it's such a fast recipe, especially if you have all your toppings ready. Really, if you had a tombstone or any of those frozen pizzas, I found this to be just as fast to prepare, but with all the homegrown produce. So let's grab our ingredients and preheat our oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 232 degrees Celsius. In a bowl, I'm just adding our flour, baking powder, our olive oil, yeast, and water all together. I like to work with a stiffer dough really, so it's a bit shaggy here, so I'm going to add just a spoonful or so of water until it gets to the consistency that I'd like. It's just a little sticky or tacky to the touch, but not too overly so. And now I'm going to let it rest for about 30 minutes. If you want a thinner crust, you can shorten the time and even use it right away. I'm going to clean up, and if you hear any scurrying or chirping sounds, the birds are running around, and while our kitten is asleep, they all get along pretty well. If you think about it, the cats need to get along with chicks and other birds, so house birds are no different. And it's just a lazy kind of rainy day today. For rolling out our dough, I like to use my linen cloth, and I like to load it up with flour to prevent sticking. I made some bread yesterday and kind of like to leave a little flour preloaded on my cloth, but if you don't have a cloth, any lightly floured surface will work, or on a parchment paper for ease of transfer. So now that our dough is ready to roll out, let's divide it in two. I forgot to light my candles, so let's light them and get back to baking. I'm rolling it out to about the size of a paper or a large plate. It's pretty quick to roll out. I'm aiming for a pretty thin crust, and it's a pretty sturdy dough, so I want it roundish, but small enough to fit our baking sheet. Also, I need to grate our mozzarella from yesterday. It's pretty soft, so I'm going to slice it up. When grating, I like to just work with a fine grade, so that's why I'm cutting these cheeses up into small squares. For longer swirls or tendrils, I'd leave the cheese in larger bits, but this is more cheese than I need for today really. So I'm going to grind this all up and freeze for later. I mentioned earlier how sheep's cheese in particular is really great for freezing, but both the milk and the cheese freeze so well and really hold their integrity well for months at a time. So I'm just going to sample some of this cheese while we work. For toppings, I have some tomatoes from our garden, and we have a few varieties growing, but for today only our sun golds are ripe enough to use. We have some basil, which I really need to top, and some pizza sauce. Some places sell sauce pre-made, and then for toppings I'm dolloping out our soft cheese onto the pizza. The soft cheese doesn't really melt and it holds its shape really well. So I'm trying to spread it out a little, just a little here or there. For tomatoes, I'm slicing them thinly. They're a cherry type tomato and really bursting with flavor. It's so hard to not snack on each of the bits, but for some more flavor, I'm adding some of our fresh basil. And once everything looks pretty good to go, let's pop it in our oven for about 8 minutes, or until the crust is a light golden brown. While our first pizza is baking, let's prep our next pizza. Sometimes we have some canned olives or artichokes to add, but I can't find anything open, so I'm just gonna go with some pepperoni. Sometimes the kids like caramelized onions on top too, but I'm getting pretty tired, so maybe next time. This is one of those recipes that's pretty fun to assemble, especially if you have everything on hand. It kind of reminds me of an adult Lunchable, really. So for the sauce, I'm not adding a whole bunch of pizza sauce, just a few spoonfuls. You can see the chunks of tomatoes in it too. All the recipes are in the description for your convenience. So our first pizza is already ready, and I need to finish up our second pizza. I love how it came out, so I'm going to work quickly so everyone can have lunch while the pizzas are still warm. And add just a little bit more pepperoni and cheese, and a quick dash of basil, and then off to the oven to cook. So while I clean up and set the table, let's go on to troubleshooting, tips, and suchness. So for storage, make sure that your cheese is stored in a non-reactive container, such as a glass container, stored in the fridge. And it's best when eaten within a couple days or frozen for later use or long-term storage. Giving the cheese a light brine bath that has a bit of the reserved whey for a couple minutes also really helps not only pop a bit of the flavor, but also helps in preventing some unwanted bacteria growth. Sometimes that means sprinkling a little salt onto the cheese prior to storage, or you can just add a little salt when mixing the curds. Soft curds or no curds. If you find that you're getting soft to no curds, first off, if you're using store-bought, change your brand to milk. If the milk is from your backyard, it helps to mind your temps while you're heat treating or pasteurizing your own milk. There are a few reasons for total milk failure. Is there sanitizer in your milk accidentally through either your milking equipment, milking containers, or storage equipment? Are you checking your livestock's health, SAC counts? What stage of lactation are you using? This can all affect our curds. I'll probably make a separate video on milking through the seasons if you'd like. Let me know if that's something you're interested in. The better your milk, the better the quality of your cheese. And not all store-bought milk is created equally. And even though some may not state that they're ultra-pasteurized, the curds don't lie. And it really borders on ultra-pasteurized line. So if you end up failing with one type of milk, switching your brands helps a lot. If you're using home-based milk, the same rules apply. All these things can really affect the quality of your milk and ultimately your dairy products. Another tip. Another place where people tend to run into trouble is at the curd cutting stage. So to help set a better curd, make sure that the citric acid is really mixed in well to the milk. Next up, make sure our rennet's still good or hasn't expired. The stretching stage is also super troublesome for folks, especially with the heat. The curds do cool pretty quickly with stretching, so it's super important to make sure that our curds are warmed thoroughly through the center for the best pull. Some books recommend doing this with kids. I think it's pretty hot for them. They definitely enjoy the stretch, but I find it's easier for them to use spoons to practice this and really just work colder and get rubberier cheese. They end up with a fun experience, and it's not as dramatic, but that's okay. How many times are good to stretch our cheese? I find it really is just a few times, 2 or 3 stretches, and that's pretty good. If you want to stretch more, you can. It'll just end up rubbery. What happens if it's too hot and you stretch it though? If it's too hot, it will literally melt through the holes in the spoon, and that's okay. Just be careful not to hurt yourself. The cheese will cool as it stretches, but if it's too hot, it may even stick to the bottom of the pot. If that happens, turn the heat of your pot down and let's cool off our whey some, then we can stretch. If you don't have a thermometer, it may be helpful to get one. Otherwise, it helps to check your curds in shorter intervals as the curds warming up. So what happens if I'm having trouble getting a stretch? If you're having trouble getting your cheese to even stretch, it helps us submerge our cheese curds into the warming whey till the curds are warmed all the way through and through, and then gently remove the curds from the whey. It may even begin stretching at this point by itself from gravity alone. So on to tasting. This is a family favorite. Sometimes we like to have a fluffy pizza, but sometimes it's really nice to have a thin crust as well. The kids definitely liken it to a Lunchable, but not derogatory. And it's just one of those fun things to be able to assemble. For myself, I definitely feel like it just hits a fun note that's definitely different from like a fluffy pizza. The tomatoes picked at peak freshness and ripeness really helps, and having fresh basil and cheese just really adds a fun nuance to everything. Overall, this is a really fun pizza, and I really hope that you and your family enjoys this pizza as much as our family does as well. If you've made it this far, an extra special thank you. I appreciate you. And if you've enjoyed diving into the sheepy side of the dairy world, hit that subscribe button and the bell where we explore a sheep-focused lifestyle every week. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, ta-tas.
Apples are yellowing or ripening?
I mean, like, it's pretty close.